But welcome to you all. We're always happy to have such a nice group for our series. And Julie, as I mentioned, is the coordinator for tonight's presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I have an incredible bio for David Dow, so I'm going to do a little bit more bio than I usually do because it's so impressive. So David is the Cullen professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where he teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law and theory, contracts, death penalty law, and First Amendment. He is the founder of the Texas Innocence Network, Texas's oldest innocence project. In addition, he and his wife co-founded the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project, which provides legal services, education, and outreach to economically and socially disadvantaged youth. In his death penalty clinic, Dow and his team of lawyers, students, and interns have represented more than 120 death row inmates at every stage of their state and federal appeals. His TED Talk on the death penalty has been viewed more than 4 million times. The author of 7 books and over 100 scholarly articles and reviews, David's work also appears in such popular publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth. His book, The Autobiography of an Execution, received the Barnes & Noble Discover Award for nonfiction and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. His next book, Things I've Learned from Dying, was named by NPR as one of the best books of 2014. And his most recent work, the novel Confessions of an Innocent Man, was a finalist for the Crooks Corner Literary Prize and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of 2019. He and his wife have 1 son and 2 dogs. They live in Texas and Colorado. And of course, the most important fact, again, is that he is a Rice graduate, having studied history and also been a lecturer in the history department for about 15 years. So everyone, let's thank and welcome David for being here tonight.
That was, I think, possibly, Julie, the most embarrassingly flattering introduction I've ever received. So thank you very much for that. And thanks to the Society of Rice University Women for inviting me to be a speaker in this series. It's really a series that I'm honored to be participating in. And in a different era, it would be nice to be in the same room with you all, although those of you who are many miles away wouldn't be able to attend if we were in that world. So there's some benefits to this one too, but it's nice to be able to see you all on my computer screen. Let me actually turn on my.
Can I just jump in and ask people, as you have questions, please enter them in the chat line. And also, right before we go to the Q&A session, let's do a photograph of everyone here. So Carrie will help us with that. So when you finish your remarks, Dr. Dow, we're going to do a photo.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. My colleagues make fun of me for the fact that the name that you see in the bottom of my Hollywood square is D.R. It's because my first name is David and my middle name is Richard, and I have always just used my initials, and so people call me Dr. Dow because they see DR, and when it happens in the grocery store or at the auto mechanic, I don't correct them because they tend to give better service to doctors. But when I'm in a room with people who actually have earned doctorates, which many of you have, I just want to stress that I'm not actually Dr. Dow. Those just happen to be my initials. I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about how I have accidentally become a death penalty lawyer. And even though teaching death penalty law was the 3rd item on the list of items that Julie mentioned when she mentioned the subjects that I teach and write in the areas of people who just know me casually, I think very often think of me as a death penalty lawyer. And that really happened quite by accident. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling you all how that happened. And then I think that will also help a little bit explain the arc of the death penalty and death penalty related books that I've written. As Julie mentioned, I majored in history at Rice, and I went from Rice to history graduate school. I was intending to be a history professor. I'm ABD in history for those keeping scores of what I haven't accomplished in my life. I wrote 2 of the 3 chapters of what was to become my PhD dissertation. And while I was still taking coursework in the graduate history program, I walked down the street and I took a constitutional theory class at the law school. And I thought to myself, oh my, this is what I really want to be doing. And so a semester and a half later, I decamped from the graduate school to the law school. But that's an important biographical fact because I didn't lose my interest in history. I just decided that it was more of an avocation for me than something I really wanted to have as a vocation. But I always maintained my interest, particularly my intellectual interest in history. And so I then eventually graduated from law school, worked for a judge, practiced law for a while, and then started looking for teaching jobs, got hired at University of Houston, which was a great place for me to be because my family is from Houston. My parents are still here. 2 of my 4 brothers live here, and we're a very close family, so it was a very attractive place for me to be. One of the classes that I was teaching was a class called Federal Courts, and what federal courts is for the non-lawyers is kind of a mix between procedural rules and constitutional doctrine. And one subset of federal courts is what is called the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is a legal device that people who are in the custody of the government can use to challenge the legality of their detention. The writ has very deep roots in English common law. It goes back at least to the 17th century. Some scholars think it goes back even earlier to the 15th century. But the point is that it was brought from common law England to the early republic and is identified by name in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution says that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except by Congress in times of emergency. Most people who teach federal courts make one of 2 choices. They either choose to not cover the writ of habeas corpus at all, or they choose to spend half the semester on it. And so most of them choose not to cover it at all. I, because of my interest in history, spent half the semester on it, which I think probably explains why the students quit taking my class and why the dean doesn't let me teach it anymore. But I had and continue to have a very deep interest in the writ of habeas corpus. At the time that I was teaching the class, it so happened that the most important habeas corpus decisions decided in the United States were death penalty cases. That is not necessarily true. And in fact, it's really not true today. I sometimes tell people that if I were 20 years younger than I am, I wouldn't even be a death penalty lawyer. I would be one of the lawyers who represents inmates who have been held at Guantanamo Bay for 20 years, because since the beginning of the so-called war on terror, the Supreme Court's most important decisions in the habeas corpus realm have dealt with enemy combatants, particularly those held at Guantanamo Bay. And so I wasn't really interested in the death penalty when I was teaching habeas corpus law. I was interested in habeas corpus, but it so happened that the most important habeas corpus cases were death penalty cases. And I thought to myself, you know, I might understand these cases better if I learned something about death penalty law. This, mind you, was 35 years ago. And 35 years ago, it was possible to spend a long weekend and you could become a death penalty expert. The body of Supreme Court cases that addressed the death penalty were very few, fewer than a dozen for sure. And so I spent a long weekend learning death penalty law, and I thought to myself, oh, now what I need to do is learn how the death penalty actually works. And at this time, which was the early mid 1990s, Congress had just set up these organizations in southern states, the so-called death penalty belt. And these were called resource centers. And the function of the resource centers was to try to find volunteer lawyers to represent people on death row, because the people on death row had a right to a lawyer at their trial, and then they had a right to a lawyer on their first appeal, which is known as a direct appeal. But then they didn't have a right to a lawyer anymore. Eventually, they got a right to have a lawyer represent them in federal court for their federal death penalty appeals, but they didn't get a right to a lawyer to represent them in state court in Texas until the mid-1990s. And so you had 1,000 people on death row across the country, and they didn't have lawyers. And so Congress thought, gosh, this is really terrible. We can't really be having the states execute all of these people who have no lawyers. And so Congress decided that the cheapest way to solve this problem was to create these resource centers, and the 30 or 40 death penalty experts in the whole country would go work at those resource centers, and then they would find lawyers who didn't know anything about death penalty law, but who these resource center lawyers would walk through the process. And even if you don't know anything about death penalty law, you're still probably better off representing the death row inmate if you have a law degree than the inmate is representing himself. And by the way, I'm going to refer to death row inmates as hims, using the masculine pronoun, because it would be precious to keep saying his or her in view of the fact that nearly 99% of the people on death row in the United States are men. I knew the people who were starting the resource center in Texas, and I asked the guy who had been a classmate a couple of years ahead of me, actually, in law school, whether I could go with him the next time he went to go visit some of his clients on death row in Texas. And he said, sure. And so I went with him one day, and I met 6 or 7 guys on that first day. And as we left the prison and were getting back into his car, this friend of mine asked whether I would like to represent one of the people who I had just met. And I said, no, I don't think so. I'm not really against the death penalty. And not only that, but I don't know the first thing about death penalty litigation or representing a death row inmate. And he said, well, I understand all that, but this guy who you just met is scheduled to be executed in 2 weeks' time. And his volunteer lawyer sent him a letter that he received 3 days ago saying the job was just too stressful. He wasn't going to be able to represent him anymore. So it's you or nobody. And that's a hard pitch for a lawyer to say no to. And so I agreed that I would work on that case. And I found that case to be intellectually challenging and satisfying and deeply emotionally satisfying. And so 1 led to 2 and 2 led to 4. And then you wake up 30 years later and you've accidentally become a death penalty lawyer. The reason I have told you that story at some length is because when I started doing this work, I wasn't against the death penalty. As Julie mentioned, I've now been doing this a long time, and I've hired over the years a dozen or 2 dozen lawyers, and every lawyer that I've hired, every single lawyer without exception, is somebody who knew when either she or he was in law school that that person wanted to do death penalty law upon graduation. Those are the bulk of the people who go into this type of work. And I wasn't. And in fact, for the first 5 or 6 or maybe 7 years that I was a death penalty lawyer, I still wasn't against the death penalty. I didn't think my own clients should be executed, obviously, but others, I didn't really care so much about. And 2 things happened to me, which are responsible for why I'm against the death penalty today. And one of them I refer to as a lawyer's moment, and one of them I refer to as a human moment. And it's important for me to tell you what these moments were, because it's these moments that I then decided eventually I wanted to write about in books. The lawyer's moment occurred when I went to the prison one day to visit 2 or 3 of my clients. And there's this phrase in death penalty law that the death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst. And when I would think about the worst of the worst, I would think about a crazy man like Charles Manson in California, or I would think about the villain Hannibal Lecter from the Jodie Foster Silence of the Lamb movies. And of course, Charles Manson wasn't on death row. He died of natural causes in prison in California. And Hannibal Lecter is a fictional character. And so when I was thinking of the type of people who were on death row, my images were somebody who's just a movie character and somebody else who wasn't actually on death row. And the people I learned who actually were on death row, who are on death row, are people who, if their lives had just been a little bit different, wouldn't be there. Now, it wouldn't be truthful for me to say that over the years and over the more than 110 or 115 guys I've represented, not a single one has been somebody who I think needs to spend his life in prison and who quite possibly came into the world already broken. But I can't think of more than a handful of my clients that satisfy that description. Every other one is somebody who, as we investigated their cases, we could identify the set of moments that if those moments had been altered, the person's trajectory in life would have been different. Why do I call this a lawyer's moment? Well, it's a lawyer's moment because the moment that you realize that whether somebody ends up on death row versus the general prison population doesn't have to do with what they did, but in fact has to do with who they are or who the prosecutor was in their case or what the climate of the area where the murder was where the murder occurred was at the time the murder occurred. You can no longer deny that factors that should not be relevant are not only relevant but are decisive. And so the very choice of who it is that we send to death row in the first place lacks principle, and lawyers are about principle. That was the lawyer moment. The human moment was that you get to know your clients. At least if you're doing your job well, you get to know your clients. My team and I build a family tree for all of our clients. It goes back, we try to make it go back 3 generations. And then we interview everybody on that family tree who's still alive. We get medical records for everybody who's on that family tree, whether they're alive or whether they're not, if we can get access to them. We interview every teacher our clients ever had, every friend, every sibling, every significant other, every child, every partner, every correction officer that they've had contact with, because almost all of them have been in the prison system before. And by the time we're through conducting an investigation, we've spoken to scores and sometimes north of 100 people about our client. And so I tell my wife and I have been married for 25 years. I tell my wife, we've been married 25 years. I still know some of my clients better than I know her because I've talked to every single person in their life. And once you know a human being at that level, once you know your client's mom and dad, sons and daughters, wife or husband, it's a person. When you read about somebody who's going to be executed, the only thing you will know is the crime that that person committed. And when the only thing that you know is the crime that person committed, you don't have any access to what makes that person a human being. But when you're a lawyer representing these people, you do. So at some point, I decided I wanted to write a book that tried to capture these 2 moments in a non-academic way. I think that I was tired and maybe a little bit frustrated about writing just for other law professors, just for judges, and wanted to write something that people like those of you listening to me right now would read. And one of my brothers, I have 4 brothers, and one of my brothers is a poet and a nonfiction writer and a teacher who lives in New York. And he connected me with an agent who he knew. The agent's name is Simon Lipscar. And I I spoke to Simon on the phone and then eventually sent him a bunch. I have two big dogs. They're participating. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I sent Simon a bunch of essays that I had written that eventually became chapters in the first book that I wrote about the death penalty. Before I wrote a book about the death penalty, my brother, who had connected me with the agent, and I edited a book about the death penalty called Machinery of Death. And then after that, I wrote a book called Executed on a Technicality that was aimed at an educated but non-specialized audience. And my goal in that book was to try to put into human terms this lawyer moment and this human moment that I had had. And I tried to do that through telling stories of individual cases. And then a few years went by and I decided, you know, what I really want to do is write a book so that people can understand how somebody who wasn't even against the death penalty when he started being a death penalty lawyer could be somebody who wakes up, 25 years later and has become a death penalty lawyer. I thought that that would be a story that would itself have some illuminating value of explaining how the system actually works. And so I wrote a book called The Autobiography of an Execution, which was really about my life as a death penalty lawyer. And it focused on a particular case. It mentioned several cases, but it focused on a particular case. And for reasons that have to do with a lawyer's duty to protect confidentiality, I had to change facts in the book. The facts that I changed were facts that to me were completely irrelevant. So, for example, a crime might have occurred in Del Rio, and I said it occurred in El Paso. And the person who committed the crime might have been 35 when he committed it. And I said he was 28 when he committed it. The person who committed the crime might have been 5'10". I said he was 6'4". The person who committed the crime might have used a 9mm semi-automatic. I said he used a 38 caliber revolver. Those sorts of facts I had to change. And the reason that I had to change those facts is because I didn't want somebody to be able to sit down at the computer and type in the list of characteristics of the person that I was writing about and then know who I was talking about. And the reason I didn't want anybody to be able to do that is because some people don't understand this, but a lawyer's duty of confidentiality extends not just to the conversation that the lawyer has with his client. That's called the attorney-client privilege. It extends to everything that the lawyer learns about his client in the course of representing her or his client. And the duty to keep that confidential remains forever. So the fact that my client might have been executed doesn't mean that I'm now free to share all of these things. So I have a very good friend who teaches legal ethics. And I said to her, I really want to write this book and tell this story, but I'm not really sure how I can do it and what I'm thinking is. And then I told her that what I was thinking about doing were changing the facts in a way that would make it somewhere between very, very hard and impossible for somebody to reverse engineer the case and figure out what case I was talking about. And she said to me, the best advice that I can give you is you shouldn't write the book. But the second best advice I can give you is to take every step that you can take to make it impossible or very hard for a person using reasonable methods to figure out who you're talking about. And so that was what I chose to do. What does that all have to do with why I'm here today and why I'm eventually going to talk to you about a novel? Because as Julie mentioned, the book was well received. It was a finalist for national awards and it won some other awards, and it was reviewed in places that I never in a million years would have expected 20 years ago that a book that I wrote would be reviewed in. But a number of the reviewers criticized me for writing a book that couldn't be fact-checked. And this really irritated me because I wasn't purporting to write a book of history, and I wasn't purporting to write journalism. I was writing a book about my life. And so it didn't really seem a fair criticism for people to say we can't fact check this book. A few years later, I wrote another nonfiction book called Things I've Learned from Dying. And that book wove together three strands. One was the death of one of my clients, one was the death of one of my dogs, and the third was the death of my father-in-law, who I was very, very close to. And same thing happened. It was reviewed in places I would never expect it. It was generally pretty well received critically, but the same sort of criticism that you couldn't fact check the part in the book that dealt with my client. You could definitely fact check the part about my father-in-law because I didn't have a duty of confidentiality. You could definitely fact check the part about my dog because the same was true there, but you couldn't fact check the part about the client of mine. And so I was complaining to my agent on the phone one day, and I said, Simon, this is just driving me crazy because why are these newspapers and magazines assigning my book for review purposes to somebody who's a journalist or who's going to try to impose journalism standards on my books when I'm not purporting to do journalism? And I was really just venting. And I said, I think the only way I can escape this is to write a novel. And he said, I think you should do that. Do you have one in mind? And it so happened that I had been thinking for a few years about the story that eventually becomes the story in the novel Confessions of an Innocent Man. I am guessing that maybe some of you have read it, some of you haven't. The book basically deals with somebody who is wrongfully convicted. And so there were really two, I think, themes that I was really inspired to write about. One of them was how it is that people get convicted when they haven't committed a crime. You know, for every 9 people that we've executed in the United States since the death penalty resumed in the modern era with the death by firing squad of Gary Gilmore in Utah in 1977, for every 9 that we've executed, 1 has been exonerated. I mean, just let that statistic think in. If you told people that there is a 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 chance when you get on that airplane that it's going to crash and every person on board is going to die, we wouldn't have an airline industry in the United States. But that is the error rate that we have in the death penalty system. Why do we tolerate that? Well, we tolerate that because my guess is that somewhere between very few and none of you know somebody who's on death row. And the reason that we don't know people on death row personally is explained by the socioeconomic structures in our society. Even if you know somebody who committed murder, the likelihood is that the person who you know who committed murder is not going to end up on death row. We tolerate this system of error because it's unimaginable to us that we ourselves will actually be victims of that error. But if you translate it into air travel, that all of us do, or at least used to do, the choices that we make become very different. And so I wanted to try in this book, the novel, to really put some flesh on how that happens. And it happens, I'm afraid to say, because prosecutors and police officers make assumptions, and then once they've made those assumptions, they suffer from the same confirmation bias that every human being who's ever been studied by psychologists suffers from, and they get locked on to a suspect when the evidence does not yet warrant being locked onto that suspect, but then they don't see anything else. That's how most wrongful convictions occur. They don't occur because the police say, I hate this SOB, I'm going to frame him and put an innocent person in prison. That's not what happens. What happens is that police officers and investigators and lawyers are human beings. They're like all of us, and they simply get committed to a narrative too early. And then once they're committed to that narrative, they are committed to that narrative, and that's how mistakes happen. And so I wanted to try to illustrate that in the book. The second thing that I really wanted to talk about was, people inevitably want to ask me how many innocent people I've represented. And the answer is, I think I've represented 8. I say I think I've represented 8. Of the 8 who I think I've represented, 3 walked out of prison. So it wasn't just that I thought it, persuaded the people who matter that they were innocent too. A 4th died in prison before I had the opportunity to exonerate him, although I think we would have. 2 of them were executed because I thought that they were innocent, but what I think doesn't really matter unless I can prove it. And then 2 others are still alive, and so we remain hopeful about that. The innocent people who I've represented who have walked out of prison, without exception, come out of prison and they claim to have no bitterness. They claim to have no anger. They claim to understand that the system wronged them, but they're looking forward to sleeping in their own bed and having a home-cooked meal and learning what a cell phone is and learning how to do email. And every time I would be standing behind somebody who was holding a press conference and being truly and sincerely not the least bit bitter, I would think to myself, wow, that person is really different from me. Because if I had spent 10, 15, 20 years in prison for a crime that I didn't commit, I would not be as forgiving as people who I represented were. And so I wanted to have a character in a book who reminded me a little bit more of myself than my actual clients have reminded me of myself when it comes to forgiving the mistakes that the legal system makes. So that was how the novel came to be. There are there's one central character in the novel, obviously, who tells the story. It's told from the first person, and so you're going to have questions about the reliability of the narrator and all that. There's another character who's very important, and people always want to know whether I'm going to write another novel, and I'll just tell you that the answer is yes. And the reason I want to write another novel is because there's a character in Confessions of an Innocent Man who I really, really like, and he's not innocent, but I want to write a book where he's a central character. Is he based on an actual one of my clients? No, he's not based on an actual one of my clients, but everything that I have learned about what actually happens inside of the prisons, everything that I have learned about what actually happens to people on death row, including my clients, is obviously something that I have learned through my clients. So I would say that he's not one of my clients, but everything that I've learned that's reflected in the book, I've learned because I've been representing these guys now for 3 decades. And I think with that, I think that I went just about the amount of time that I was allowed to go, maybe just a tiny little bit over. And
okay, so thank you. And before we go to questions, let's take our photo for our Facebook page. So everyone who'd like to have their picture, please put your camera on so we can see you. Everyone, I see a lot of people with just their names and not their face. If you could change to put your camera on, that would be very helpful. And then our great Rice Alumni Office representative, Carrie Pius, is going to take the picture for us. So Karen, maybe you do the countdown. People are still getting on their cameras on, so maybe wait another couple of seconds to allow people to do that. And we have so many people, I think Carrie's going to have to take a couple of photos of the different screens. So keep your smile ready for a while. Okay. Karen, you're muted.
Okay, are we ready? 1, 2, 3, smile.
Okay, we're done. All right, so the first question we have on the chat line comes from Elias Cortina. Elias, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Hey, DR, it's great to have you here. And
Thank you.
My question, you gave a lot of reasons why you gave up believing in the death penalty, and I was wondering if there's any philosophical or religious reasons that you see that are in contradiction and opposition to the death penalty that might have entered your thinking also.
Elias, thank you very much for that question. My youngest brother is a rabbi, actually, and before I became, a committed atheist myself, when I was much younger, I think in high school, at some point I actually entertained the possibility of going to rabbinical school myself. All of my brothers and I went to Jewish day school and then continued to go to Hebrew school through high school. When I was growing up, we would have dinner together. Our whole family would always have dinner on Shabbat, Friday night. We still actually do frequently, and my dad would lead a discussion of either the Torah portion for that week or some Talmudic passage that we would argue about, always lovingly. But there was a lot of arguing that went on at the Shabbat dinner table at my family, and so I've thought actually about the religious approach to the death penalty very seriously and for a very long time, and what I would say about it, Eliza, and I hope that this is a useful answer to your question, and if it's not, you can just tell me that I haven't answered your question, and I'll take crack 2 at it. The question of what religion says about the death penalty obviously depends on the religion. Islamic law unquestionably sanctions the use of capital punishment. The Catholic Church, since the Second Vatican Council, has said that Catholicism forbids the use of capital punishment. I don't know very much about Eastern religions, so I don't know what Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism say. Judaism formally allows capital punishment. The Jewish Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, prescribes the death penalty for certain offenses. However, the body of Jewish law is really contained in the Talmud, not in the so-called Old Testament. And by rabbinical times, it was already, as a practical matter, impossible to carry out the death penalty. The rabbis were embarrassed about it. And so they erected procedural barriers that made it, for all intents and purposes, impossible to carry out. For example, there would have to be a witness to the entirety of the crime. So, for example, if a witness saw somebody pursuing somebody else with a knife and then chase that person around a corner and then come back moments later with a bloody knife, and then we discover that the person around the corner is dead, that is not a sufficient witness because the person has not seen the entirety of the crime. The rabbi said that the person who is witnessing the crime has to warn the person who's about to commit the crime, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times, not to do it. So not only would this person who's watching the person with the knife pursue somebody else have to see the whole thing, the person would have to warn him and warn him and warn him again. And if that procedure is lacking, then the death penalty can't be carried out. So what we know about Catholicism, we know about Catholicism because Catholicism is a hierarchical religion, and the hierarchy says you can't carry out capital punishment. That doesn't mean the Catholic masses don't believe in it, for the same reason that the Catholic Church says abortion is murder, but there are members of the Catholic laity who who don't believe that. The same is obviously true in Judaism. The fact that the rabbis have erected these procedural barriers doesn't mean that there aren't Jews who very strongly favor the death penalty. And as some of you will know, the state of Israel hanged Adolf Eichmann after kidnapping him in Argentina for war crimes. So the view that I'm offering is a view that if we were sitting around a Shabbat dinner table, people would be arguing about. My pet peeve, however, is the evangelical support for the death penalty, because whenever I have a conversation with somebody who is a committed evangelical Protestant and the person supports the death penalty by referring to the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life language in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, I point out that it is true that that language is in the Hebrew Bible, not just once, but twice. But what crimes is the death penalty prescribed for? It's of course prescribed for murder, but not just murder. It's prescribed if you violate the Sabbath. So if you do something on the Sabbath that you're not permitted to do, death penalty. It is prescribed for various sex crimes. So fornication, sex outside of marriage, death penalty. It is prescribed if a child is disrespectful of his parents. Okay. Now, my wife and I have been blessed. We have one son, Lincoln. He's a junior in college. I can't think of a single day of his life that he's ever been disrespectful. Okay. But when I was a kid, I'm ashamed to say, sometimes disrespectful towards my parents. The fact that the Hebrew Bible would have authorized my execution because of that is astonishing. And so what I tell my evangelical friends who say I'm in favor of the death penalty because there it is in Leviticus, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for life, I say, I don't think you get to pick just the punishment uncoupled from the crime that the Hebrew Bible attaches the punishment to. It seems to me that consistency requires that if you're going to say, I support the death penalty because it's right there in the book of Leviticus, then you need to support the death penalty for the crimes that the book of Leviticus prescribes it for. But I honestly can't think of a single person, who would do that, even very vocal death penalty supporters. I will, and Elias, this is a little bit off the point of your question, but in part, the reason I told you all a little bit about my early views on the death penalty was because I understand people who support the death penalty. I mean, I understand people who support the death penalty because I used to support the death penalty. I'd like to think that I would understand them even if I didn't, but maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. I definitely do because I once did. And I don't have any confidence that I could have a conversation with somebody who is morally committed to the death penalty and change that person's mind on the abstract moral question. I might be able to persuade the person that the system that we have in the United States is not working well, that race matters and it shouldn't, that economic status matters and it shouldn't, that prosecutorial discretion matters too much, that certain counties are responsible for almost all executions and that shouldn't be the case. But when it comes down to the fundamental moral question of whether the state ought to execute citizens for committing certain crimes, there are some people who think that the answer to that question is no, and there are some people who think the answer to that question is yes. And I don't think that I have the persuasive power to persuade somebody who believes that the philosophical answer to that question is yes to change her or his mind. I do think, however, that I can persuade somebody to say that we shouldn't be executing people until we've solved what I characterized earlier as the lawyer problem. And I also think that I can persuade people that the death penalty doesn't make us any safer. And given that it doesn't make us any safer, we have to ask ourselves a very hard question of whether we should be spending as much money on a punishment that doesn't make us any safer when we could be spending a whole lot less and getting all of the same security benefit that we get. Okay, so what do I mean by this? The death penalty supporter will say, if we execute somebody, that person is never going to commit a murder again. And I say, yes, that's true. And it's also true that if we put somebody in prison for the rest of his life, that person is never going to commit murder again. There's never been anybody who was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. There's never been a single person who was in the United States who was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole who escaped from prison. So we can sentence murderers to life without the possibility of parole, and they're also not going to kill anybody again. So now we've got these two different punishments that will achieve the same objective, which is to keep society safe. So let's ask ourselves, what do we pay for one versus what do we pay for the other? These numbers are very hard to get, but about 5 or 6 years ago, several of my students and I collected vouchers in 4 or 5 death penalty cases from across the state of Texas to figure out what we were actually spending on these cases. And the typical death penalty case would cost about $2 million. A somewhat complicated death penalty case would cost $3 million. There were some that cost over $5 million. The United States government spent, estimates are, somewhere between $18 and $25 million to get a death sentence for the Boston Marathon bomber. Okay. This is a lot of money. It costs somewhere between twice and 5 times as much to sentence somebody to death as it does to sentence that person to prison for the rest of his life. And in my own practice as a death penalty lawyer, we are most successful in avoiding the death penalty by going to meet with the district attorney before the trial even starts and saying to the district attorney, if you pursue this case as a capital case and pursue it all the way to verdict and get a death sentence, your county is going to spend $2.5 or $3 million. There's a small chance, it's not a large chance, but there's a small chance that the case will get thrown out on appeal and then you'll have to do it again. Whereas we will today, while we're sitting here in this conference room with you, agree that our client will plead guilty and agree to serve a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, and the amount of legal expenses that we've incurred so far are $15,000. So you can spend $2.5 or $3 million chasing a death verdict, or you can spend $15,000 or $20,000 getting a life sentence without parole. What would you rather do? This is county money. If you spend it chasing a death sentence, then there's less money to fix the potholes. We could be spending the money to buy laptops for kids in inner city schools. This is the reason that almost all deaths, Texas has 254 counties. More than half of those counties have never sent somebody to death row because they're not going to spend the money doing it. Almost all death sentences in Texas come from the 10 biggest, richest counties because they're willing to squander money because the district attorney thinks that it looks good in a commercial when the district attorney is running for re-election. But it doesn't make economic sense in Texas. It doesn't make economic sense for the federal government to be doing it. It doesn't make economic sense for it to be happening anywhere. And the best argument that I can make when I'm trying to persuade somebody not to pursue a death penalty in a particular case or to abandon the death penalty generally is to say, if you can spend $2.5 million and get a prize, or spend $20,000 and get the exact same prize, what do you do?
David, we've got several questions and time is getting short, so
okay. I'll give shorter answers.
Karen has a question for you. Karen, unmute yourself, please.
As I told you, I'm a liberal studies
Yes.
person, and I'm wondering about who your fictitious character is that you want to write another book about.
Ricky Sargent is his name. And so he's just called Sargent throughout the book. He's very rarely called by his first name. But he commits a terrible crime. But what I think is interesting about him, and this is something that I've noticed in a number of my clients, this goes back to something I said 45 minutes or so ago when I was talking about how if the lives of these guys had just been a tiny bit different, they wouldn't be where they are. And I have clients who have mind-boggling talents. I have clients who who can play multiple chess games in their head simultaneously. I have clients who write music. I have clients who are spectacular artists. I have clients who write stories and who write poetry and who write beautiful letters. These are people who have all sorts of qualities that we admire in other people, and they have qualities that we're drawn to in other people, but they aren't seen in my clients because, as I said, all that you know about my client is the murder that he committed. And so I really wanted to have a character in Confessions be somebody like that. And as I was writing that character, I was thinking, I just need to write another book just so I can write a book that has this character as the center.
Thank you. Brian has a question for you. Brian, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Julie. Asking from my rather checkered background, I'm now semi-retired social psychologist. Before that was an attorney. And my real question is, where would we, writ large, where should we focus our energies to reduce error rates, which I know is horribly euphemistic. And that could be from academic perspectives, that could be from my students I'll be teaching in psych and law next semester, who see injustice in the world and they want to know how to change it. And I'd like to point them in a good direction.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for teaching that class and for steering them. What Julie referred to my TED Talk on the death penalty. What I say in the TED Talk is the earlier the better. So in the context of a death penalty case, if you're just looking at the death penalty case, the place where you ought to be spending all of your resources is at the very beginning of the death penalty case, which is the trial. By the time I and my team come along at the appellate stage, sometimes at the very late appellate stages, the likelihood of nudging the train off the rail is remote. It's not great even at trial, but it's a lot greater. And part of the reason for that is because juries have become skeptical about the death penalty, and they've become skeptical about the death penalty because we all know about mistakes now. The beauty of the national innocence movement is that it's called attention to the number of people who did not commit any crime at all who are in prison, and that's now on TV shows and movies and just in the ethos. And so that ethos is inhaled by people who are on juries. And so if you're on a jury in a death penalty case, you can't ignore that there are other jurors who were sure they had the right person and they were wrong. And so if you're just a little bit humble, you think it's not only other people who could be wrong, it's possibly me too. And so what is the hedge that you make as a juror? The hedge is that you convict, but you don't sentence to death. And that way there's time for the mistake, and you don't have to live with the burden if the person is executed and then the mistake is made. And so we end up with more and more life sentences. And as we end up with more and more life sentences, district attorneys seek the death penalty less and less often, because remember, I just told you a few minutes ago, they're spending a whole lot of money chasing a death sentence. And it doesn't really make sense to do it at all, but it definitely doesn't make sense to do it if you're going to spend all that money and then the jury's not going to even give you the death sentence at the end of the trial. So in the TED Talk, I talk about focusing early in the death penalty process. But the real answer to your question, Brian, is that you got to go even earlier than that. And the reason that my wife and I started the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project is because we wanted to get to these kids when they're in the juvenile justice system. I have my middle brother. You would never know this because there's nobody in the in the history of doing good work who has been more effective at keeping his name out of the media than my middle brother has been. But he has spent a professional career developing programs for early childcare for people who don't have access to early childcare, lower economic status, young kids, toddlers. That's how you solve the problem in the long run, by intervention. My wife and I are trying to intervene earlier in the criminal justice process. The nth iteration of that is to intervene before the kid even has contact with the criminal justice system. So the earlier the better.
David, we have 2 questions that can be answered really quickly.
Okay.
Because we're really out of time.
All right.
I'm just going to pose them just to save some time. Eileen asked, why and how does pursuing the death penalty cost so much?
Boy, that's so hard to answer in a short amount of time, but I will just tell you, because a death penalty trial is unlike any other kind of trial. In a typical criminal case, the lawyers might pick a jury in a couple of hours. In a death penalty case, picking the jury takes 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes takes 2 or 3 months. In a typical criminal case, you don't conduct the type of investigation that I was just talking about a little bit earlier when I was talking about a family tree of 3 generations and interviewing hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. And the reason is because a death penalty trial involves what all other trials involve, which is the question of whether the person committed the crime. But then if the jury says yes, it involves this second question that is unique to the death penalty domain, and that is the question of whether we ought to execute this person. It's not an is question, it's an ought question. And the Supreme Court has held that the lawyers representing the defendant are entitled to give the jury every possible reason why they should answer that ought question no. And so what that means is that there's an investigation that's conducted in a death penalty case that will last a year or 18 months, where you're paying lawyers and investigators for a year and a half of work, and you haven't even started picking the jury yet. And then once you have the trial, it's not just one trial, but it's 2 trials. They're called phases, but they're really different trials. And the first one, the jury says, did this person do it? And then the second one is, should we punish this person by death or by life in prison? And so what I'll just say, and then that'll be the end of the answer, Julie. I know you're nervous. 75% of the cost of a death penalty case is consumed at the trial. Only 25% is consumed during appeals. So people say, oh, let's just cut down on the cost by, as soon as the person is convicted and sentenced to death, take him out behind the courtroom and shoot him. And I say, okay, that I got some problems with that, but you're not going to save the money by doing that, because 75% of the money is already spent by the time you shoot him behind the courthouse.
One quick question. In your cost analysis, do you include the cost of food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare? The question's from Nancy Bailey.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. It costs about $20,000 a year to house an inmate in Texas in a high security facility. Why does it cost so little? Because all the prisons are already built, and because we don't pay prison guards very much money, and because we give prisoners crappy food and crappy medical care. I'm not saying we should give them filet mignon, and I'm not saying that we should give them access to cutting edge medical care. I'm just telling you that that's why it only costs $20,000 a year to keep somebody in a maximum security prison. If somebody lives to be 50, if you're sent to prison when you're 25, 26, if you live 50 years in prison, which you're not going to, your life expectancy is shorter in prison than it is outside of prison for obvious reasons, including bad food, bad healthcare, and violence. If you live 50 years in prison, 50 times $20,000 is $1 million. Okay, so $2.5 million for the death sentence, $1 million to keep you in prison for the rest of your life. It's cheaper even when you take that into account, but it's an excellent question.
So I just want to say, I usually throw in a question when there's no questions, and I have about 20 questions for you as a writer, but we'll have to have another session perhaps, or another opportunity to talk with you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And I, as a writer myself, I really have some questions for you about nonfiction versus fiction. I'm impressed with your ability to write both.
Well, you know where to find me, and I'll come back anytime. I've had a really wonderful time. Thank you all again for having me.
Karen, over to you.
Well, yes. Well, thank you, David. This has been fascinating. You've presented stuff that we don't think about when we hear the news and see things in the newspaper. And I so appreciate that. And I sure others do too. And I want to say I appreciate everybody who has tuned in tonight. Our next author will be Miranda James, who used to be the manager of Murder by the Book in Houston. And that's January 10th. If you want to find the SRUW events, you just Google alumni events and go down the calendar, and they're identified. And we're going to have others. I don't know if we'll be, well, we won't be able to see you again until January. Please remember and join us again.